What you're seeing from this slide actually is just outside my studio. So it's a window view. And I showed this to you mainly because I just want to tell you how much has changed in Hong Kong. And I have been in the studio since 2003 with only green in front of my window. Unfortunately, since perhaps like 2 years ago, and there's a tower in front of it. As you could see, it's really like blocked so much of the view. But this is the life in Hong Kong, I suppose. Maybe I could really talk about my experience with Parasite, which is we started in the 90s, and the background of it, and also how the artists have been involved in it. And so here, this picture was taken in 2007, July 1st. And I particularly picked this because I suppose protest has been always like a casted image for media nowadays, especially since 1.5 years ago. But actually, it's been long history in Hong Kong. I think like people in Hong Kong always found that we always had this freedom to demonstrate and protest until recently. And so this is a banner, which is a work made by me. It was written in Tibetan. Actually, is an exhibition. It's an art project curated by Tobias Berger in 2007 when he was the director of Parasite. And he just commissions a bunch of artists to create a banner and then just join the march. So I think from this sense, protest could be also a creative space, as we actually have seen like last year in Hong Kong. And the meaning of it is not really important. I just wanted to create a banner nobody could really understand. But since it's written in Tibetan, so people probably would be sensitive to it. But actually, it's kind of like very banal meaning behind the banner. It's nothing political. So the background about parasites, I should really start it from the so-called like the past futures of Hong Kong. Of course, now Hong Kong is part of China, but Hong Kong was a British colony. And it was only in 1984 they decided to return Hong Kong to China. And 80 is such a background of my upbringing when I went to high school and also later to the university. And so it's so much like my childhood or the youth memory, and also the days when I started studying art. And just a few years ago, actually, I did a kind of research or study of an artist who's called Josh Horn. And he was a very important artist in my memory in the 80s because I was an art student and he was super famous. But one day he just disappeared from the art scene of Hong Kong. And for a very long time, nobody heard of him. And that's how I became very interested in him. So I made this study of him. I found out that he later became a psychotherapist. And he was having enough of art in Hong Kong. But also like it was part of the history after the Tiananmen event in 1989. And he was so broken, and then he decided to leave Hong Kong. But then because of his activities in Hong Kong in the 80s, so his career in such a very short span of 10 years somehow represents so much the art scene of Hong Kong. And then you could really see that like Josh Horn as a center is so connected to everything, the theater. He also had his own soccer team, teaching art, exhibiting art. He was also very much like a champion for contemporary art in Hong Kong, organizing different forums, talks, projects. But I think this is somehow more or less representing how small the art world of Hong Kong was in the 80s. And I have to say, Parasite somehow owned so much from the artists from the 80s, and it was the first time they would make their artist-run space. In my best knowledge, I didn't hear earlier artist-run spaces before, and so he made a project in his studio. So I was quite amazed in the mid-90s, I think it's 1994, when I started my MFA study. And I was so curious how we could really make art in Hong Kong. There wasn't really art market, and with very few art institutions. There was the Hong Kong Art Center, the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and a couple of commercial galleries, and that's it. And very much it was so like self-help, and artists had to do everything. So the 90s, because of the handover, it's 1997. So all of a sudden we also had attracted such international attractions. It was kind of like interesting to really contemplating the handover. So a lot of artists would really experiment with installations, worked with narratives addressing the politics locally or even with China, and also many experimental ways to deal with contemporary art, including doing performances and many different things. And somehow I think our friendship for Parasite, so this is the first poster for Parasite. It was in 1996. The first opening, actually, it was my birthday. It was not intentional, but it just happened. So we basically, we have friends of 7, and in the very beginning, we just tried to do an exhibition together, but it was very difficult because you didn't really have like a user-friendly space who could allow you to do many like experimental ways of putting up your work, like taking the floor, for example. So we thought that instead of like borrowing or renting space from others, maybe we could try out to doing something in an alternative space. So we found this storefront in this a very quiet residential area in the west side of Hong Kong Island. That's why we put this program as like artists in Western. Indeed, it was before we had really the name of Parasite. Parasite as a name was somehow just like the last invention before the publicity. Of course, Parasite also had a meaning in a way. So this is the time like we rented this amazing space for 4 months, and we staged free exhibition because we didn't really have studios ourselves. We only had our home or apartments, very small desks to work on. We never had such an amount of space to work, but to do installation, it would be very difficult if you would just do it at home. So it was the time that in the 90s, a lot of artists would just set up their work in a gallery for the first time, as they had no chance to see this work completed at home or in the studio. And so our idea was like using the space as the temporary studio or workshop to fabricate the work. And then we just exhibit it on site. It somehow reflects sort of like a post-colonial narratives in our discussions. It was kind of like trendy thing to read. And so Parasite was basically mentioned by a post-colonial theorist, Wei Chao, and when she tried to describe Parasite as something to work around the field without taking up over the field. And then I found it was kind of interesting as a very temporary user of the space. What we wanted just the time to show our expression. And then the second one with the slash, I think it was time that like 1 year later, we properly set up the space of Parasite, which you could really say is an alternative space. After this first program of 3 exhibitions, we were very encouraged. And it was something back then new to the people or the art scene. And as a temporary project, we found very encouraged, and we really started to think that if it's possible to have a site that we could really continue for a longer time, because if you could have longer time, you basically could have more possibilities. And we have done a lot of publication. I think there's so much like personal interest. I actually worked in a publishing house as a full-time job for 2 years before we started Parasite. And so basically I was very interested in publishing. And also another member, Zhang Dakping, and he's actually a graphic designer, and he also did a lot of books as well. And we also had people who like to write, like Phoebe Man, Lambosan, or Lamei Peng. So with this kind of combination, we would just try to exercise what could be possible. The first year of Parasite, we also started with solo exhibition. But then we also tried to maintain sort of dialogue. So we would also invite other artists to be engaged with this solo exhibition and then to create another solo exhibition. I think conversation was something we were so eager to do, because I suppose like the art scene was so small and we always would feel so lonely. And if you would not really have a response. And that's why I think artist group, artist organization is almost like a natural product of the early stage of any art scene. And art clubs have been in Hong Kong for a very long time. But then it was more like only on the friendship. And for us, we started with friendship, but we also wanted more besides its social gathering function, because we were really serious about art. And then different from the usual art organization, now we also had the space. And we thought it's really empowerment, because once you could have this space and you could have this say what to show, all of a sudden we found that actually, even as the artist run space, we could actually tell it's sort of like the DNA of this power structure. So on one hand, we tried to be open, but all the time we know that we had this power in our hands, how we could really share these powers with others. So we started with, calling for proposals. But I think for 1 year, it's somehow like that. I think later on, it's year 2000, but still like 99, 98, we still work so much with friends by invitations and ask them to curate shows. It was a time that like we had the opportunity to travel. So we also connect ourselves with like-minded people in other cities. So even from the very beginning, in 1997, we started working with West Base of Melbourne. It was only because like one time I had this opportunity to go to Melbourne. So I was just curious if there were any other people doing similar things like what we've done. And so on the left-hand side, you could see Material Prima in 1999. It was actually the second project we worked together, but this time it was more like a residence project. So we had like 3 artists from Australia to come to Hong Kong, and then 3 artists from Hong Kong to go to Melbourne for a month to create new work. And on the right-hand side, you can see coffee shop. It was collaboration among members of Parasite. We tried to adapt our creativity into something we have been talking so much. It's almost like sort of casual conversation. Everybody would like to have their own coffee shop, so why didn't we make one? Of course, this is not a real coffee shop. We would just like to make use the mode of coffee shop to explore something more, like how people would like to react to the space, what's the meaning of public space, and so on. I think connecting with people outside would be somehow like witnessing or expanding the practice possibilities, or also the discussions. And here you can see that is the installation done by Yoshiaki Kahatsu. Perhaps some of you would know. And I met him with the ACC grant in New York, and we became friends. And so I invited him to do a solo project at Parasite in 2000, and when I came back to Hong Kong. So this is how we evolved our program. We started with friends, and as we had more friends, and also these friends would be from overseas, and then we just enriched the program. And I still would say that like art is such very old profession, very, very old profession, and you always relied on physical contact and communication. And friendship would be so much like a very good lubricant. Of course, you know, you are serious about art, you are concerned with the work itself as well. But the possibility to establish this kind of correspondence is really important to deepen our learning of each other's work. And this kind of network expanded in 2001. We organized the International Symposium, which is called the Space Travel, Artists Run Spaces Beyond a Local Context. The mid-90s, we first had these opportunities of internet that allowed to connect with any other people in the world, which would not be possible before that. I think this is also another empowerment because of this communication technology. And then also I found from the year 2000, it's also this kind of like mushrooming of international exhibitions like biennales and all over Asia. And that allows artists to travel, which was not possible for my, senior. In Guangzhou Biennale in 2002, Hao Hanru and Charles Ashes spot this or have this observation. So they invited all these different spaces to Korea as part of the Guangzhou Biennale. And very interesting ideas. So basically, we reconstruct the physical space of Parasite by half in Korea, as you can see this the installation. So it's totally a collaboration of different members of Parasite. I mean, Parasite. So of course, the basic structure it was still so much like artist run in terms of the decision making process. And we still adopt this call for proposal. 2003, it was another opportunity. I was not involved in this project, but like Parasite was selected as a collective for the Hong Kong Pavilion in Venice Biennale. I think this somehow has sort of like creating the international profile of Parasite, and at least like people would have heard of the name of Parasite. But then we maintained it still as an art space. It was almost like the peak time when Parasite went to Venice, and then all of a sudden you would also think that it's kind of like drained out, and what should be next? So we actually thought that maybe we could hire a curator to run Parasite, and it was controversial. Our first curator was Tobias Berger, who is not local Hong Kong citizen. And at that moment, when he was coming to Parasite as a curator, and he's from New Zealand, he was running art space in Auckland, which is similar to Parasite. In the beginning, it was difficult. Parasite was the artist-run space. All of a sudden, you had the curators, and we all would notice like there could be always this power structure between curators and artists. But at the same time, it was difficult because we had been calling for proposals, and when he came by and he stopped calling for proposals. So all of a sudden people thought that, was it something anti-democracy? But my second look at it was, if you would tell people, you call for proposals, but you're actually exercising your power to turn down others, many others. And you can imagine how much time you spend to prepare for a proposal. It might not be a good thing to do because you basically kind of like create a force of course, that should be the ways to do a proper calling for proposal and screening process. But as I mentioned that like we at the same time wanted to encourage curatorial practice. So why not? If we have curator, we should curate our own program. At the same time, I think a year later, we also started a curatorial program led by Tobias Berger. It was a very small program. Every year, there were just like a few students. But we started this. And that's somehow interesting because with new people, you can always have new network. And it was important moment. And also it was the time that I found I should really step back. So I think a year after Tobias worked at Parasite, I retired from the board as well. Because at the art fair, I think we started to really see the booming art scene in Hong Kong. We had more commercial galleries, also very big galleries, some overseas would also open in Hong Kong. But at the same time, there would be also like a new nonprofit initiative. One of this is the Spring Workshop. It's very interesting. It was started by Mimi Brown. I think she moved it to Hong Kong in early 2000. But then she had this idea, and by trade, she's a musician. She really wanted to be engaged in the interesting art scene in Hong Kong. So she made the space as a project only for like 6 years. And it was very successful because you could really find that like how we could really create ecology of the art scene. You have, you know, Parasite, which was very small, but very ambitious. And then you never had a really like big museum. I mean, the Hong Kong Museum for Art was kind of like bureaucratic, you know, it's part of the Hong Kong government. And so they always had their limitations in programming. Because of Art Basel, and I think I'm going to round up. And then we also have the protest everybody learned. It was a big discussion if the Art Basel should continue early this year because of the protest. And this protest had totally changed the political landscape, even the artist landscape in Hong Kong. With the new national security laws from the summer, and that would be the censorship for sure. How we could maintain the freedom of speech would be very challenging. And all of a sudden, like this identity of Hong Kong has become so strong ever, never we have seen. That reminds me, I actually made this book like 2 years ago, and it was a series of interviews of the artists I did in the 90s. It was the same time when we started Parasite. I think it totally out of my curiosity, and I was engaged in a research project of contemporary art in Hong Kong. And then I went out to interview artists because I was just so curious as well. In such a small art scene in Hong Kong, how could you be an artist? I think this is basically the question when I was doing my MFA. You know, MFA basically is professional study for you to be an artist. But in Hong Kong, what's the meaning of artist? That's why, so I just did this interview series, like I think with like 40 some artists. And then I had all this written. And then they were just like in the hard drive, and only after 20 years. And I thought that when the whole world has become so different, and it was the time in the 90s, there was no art fair, no M+, no Parasite, nothing. And all the artists were just like so genuine to create their own work and what's their own identity. And in the old days, the challenge to be an artist basically was an economic question. You would be broke. How could you make your living? But 20 years later, the question is different. Now you could have successful artists, but then being an artist, you could actually be put in jail. I mean, there's a risk because of this, political situation. So I think it was something very challenging. We all need to really think about nowadays. And concerning our identity is never something like political now. It was mainly a cultural thing, but now to claim Hong Kong as a special identity could be something problematic as well. We never know, as everything could be so uncertain. And so this is the pages of the book, and I basically interview all my friends. And some of them were not my friends, as I need to meet more people. I just wanted to see how active artists would they make their work. So I just asked them what were their educations, what were their concerns, how did they think about their Hong Kong identity. And actually, it was very interesting. It was done in 90s. Still, a lot of people would be thinking so much about would politics be too obvious to do, or would they be concerned with the shadow of the Tiananmen massacre? And so it was really like this so-called old story. It was no longer relevant 20 years later when you had this like successful art fair, or even now when the political landscape has shifted so much. But this is something I think we need to adjust very often now. Parasite is going to celebrate its 25th anniversary, and when you look back, 25th or 25 years actually is the half period of this promise of China to allow the freedom in Hong Kong, or this one country, two systems policy. So what would be the next 25 years could be very interesting, I think. To end my talk, I just like to mention once again Josh Horn, and he was my subject of research. I went to see him particularly in this small town in Canada after he quit Hong Kong, and he just moved to Canada in this small town outside Vancouver, I think for 3 hours drive, which is called Hope. And when I saw him, and he opened his artwork for me to see for the first time after 20 years. So I think with this period of time, many things could happen. And I also remembered he told me that like when he studied in the United States, it was a time that they were the only Chinese. Basically, you would not really see other Chinese from mainland China as their classmates. So how we can deal with the change, new possibilities and new challenges, I think we always need to be more sensitive with what's happening, and also to look back. I think I just stopped here now. Thank you very much.